Welcome to Amipal, the #1 place on the internet for the sweetest Amiga content. I'm going to Workbench today and I'm going to try and explain to you the difference between WBStartup, the startup sequence and user startup and how you can use those. So let's take a look. Let's start with the startup sequence. Startup sequence exists in the S directory, the S drawer on your sys partition, whether you've named it Workbench, Amiga, Workbench 3.1, whatever. Let's show where it is on mine. So, show all files, S. And here we go, the S directory, and you've got loads of different files in there for various bits and pieces. There's startup sequence and user startup both exists in S. I'm using Black's editor to view this. I could always bung it in multi-view or edit pad, whatever you've got installed, but Black's is quite a good editor. So here we go. Nice modern startup sequence from 1993. Now this is for Workbench 3.1, so I'll run through it just so you can see what's in there, and I'll try to explain bits and pieces as I go. What's it gone over there for? I haven't used Blacks in a while, as you can tell. So startup sequence, as you can see, it's not too long. There aren't many things needed to set up Workbench, but this is the startup sequence, and these are the programs that get executed to create the environment for finally load WB to be executed. Comments are with a semicolon, as you can see. First up we have setpatch. Setpatch is a little program in C. As you can see, most of the programs are in the C directory. Setpatch is used to basically fix errors within the Kickstart ROMs. So if there's anything that's a bit buggy, then you know there should be stuff in setpatch that will fix that, because obviously it's easier to you know, patch in software than to release some new ROMs. Patch open WB, that's not usually in there. We can come back to that. Version, well, you execute version to kind of get information as to the version of specific things. Add buffers. Add buffers. Buffers are basically sections in memory which act a bit like caches for devices. So here we're adding 15 buffers to DF0. Fail at error code 21. That's just so that it falls over in the CLI as it's booting. Okay, here. C make the RAM T, RAM clipboards, RAM env, RAM env sys. This is basically setting up your RAM disk. RAM disk is already set up really, but it's creating the directories within the RAM disk so that it's functional, so that when you copy and paste things it goes into clipboards, and environment variables are stored in env. C copy envarc to RAM env. Envarc is a directory within sysprefs, which is basically the physically stored settings for various applications and Workbench and other bits and pieces. This C copy envarc to env is basically copying those settings to RAM, so that they can be executed nice and fast, and also so that when you go to use, it basically updates env rather than envarc. And when you go to save in applications, when you change preferences, it goes into envarc. Resident, this is basically making sure that things like assign and execute are kept in memory. Here we go with assign. You see, because assign's been made resident, you don't have to plonk a C colon in front of it to execute it anymore. So we're assigning env to RAM env. That basically means that so that when you're in CLI shell, you can basically type env colon instead of having to type RAM env. And similarly with all the other ones, but we'll talk about assigns again later on. FBlit ftexts, they are some programs I've put into my users into my startup sequence, so I won't talk about those just yet. bind drivers, CMount. This is basically where things that exist in devices mounted within devs get executed, so that we load different devices, things like monitor drivers, printers, device drivers, things like that. And we go down and we go down. So we set a few environment variables, including Workbench versions, Kickstarter versions, language that's being used, that sort of thing. It's gone to the end. It's not helpful, is it? Maybe I should have started with multi-view. See, add data types. Data types, of course, are a fantastic addition from Workbench 3.0 and up, where you can pretty much open any file type as long as you have the data type installed. So even though development of Workbench 3.1 stopped with the death of Commodore, you can still open modern data types like PNG, newer versions of JPEG, and the web image format that Google made recently. So, you know, fantastic. iPrefs, FPprefs, I believe iPrefs is to do with something to do with setting up the screen correctly. FPprefs is a application that I've installed, so again, I'll talk about that later. ConClip is all about clipboards. Setting up some paths here. If exists, suser startup. Execute suser startup. So this is the point in the startup sequence where your user startup script gets executed. As I said earlier, it exists in the S directory as well. And then basically at this point we then remove the resident commands for execute and assign. You could probably leave those in, really. I mean, as long as you've got the memory. A lot of this stuff, bear in mind, you're trying to keep as small a profile of operating system within like 2 megs of chip RAM. This is what it's supposed to boot into. So if things aren't needed in memory and they can be executed just from the disk at a later point, then why not? So these remove it. I can probably comment those out at this point. And at this point, C load WB, and so Workbench gets loaded. And we close the CLI that all that was executing in. And so we come to a screen that looks almost identical to the one we were already looking at. But no, this is user startup. Now, as you saw previously, user startup gets executed from the startup sequence right near the bottom before load WB executes. User startup's kind of the place where I think Commodore basically expected people to put things that needed setting up for various programs to run. So you'll see from here, CA prefs, new icons, def icons. These are all stuff that gets executed for the new icons package to run properly. Then we also have Magic User Interface, MUI, as it's known. MUI, Magic User Interface, is a kind of a suite of GUI elements that provide a much more modern GUI than the standard GAD tools offered from Commodore itself. So, resizable elements, customizable fonts, gradients, backgrounds, that kind of thing. I'll probably do a video on it at some point, but not right now. So again, this is setting up MUI. We don't really need to know about it, but it gets put into the user startup rather than bunging up your startup sequence, because there's a lot of stuff to get done in there. MUI Rex here. This is again something that uses MUI and also interfaces with AREX, which is part of MIGROS 3.0 and up. And then down here we've got some other things. Assigns. Okay, so this basically, like I said earlier, where I was talking about assigning env to RAM env, so you only have to type env in CLI. The same goes with Blitz 2 here. So when you try and do some stuff with Blitz Basic, you might open up a file requester and then it won't go anywhere because it doesn't know where it exists. So we assign Blitz 2 to work programs bits 2, because that's where it exists on the disk, and therefore if I want to access that in a file path via CLI or via let's show you. If I go here and go into volumes, look, Blitz, it basically exists with the standard devices up the top. So here we've got devices, whether it's partitions on my SD card, ADH 0, 1 and 2, whether it's the RAM disk or whether it's the disk in my internal floppy drive here. And then underneath that we've got all of the assigns that we've got set up on this system. So bed, for instance, is one set up for Black's editor. Blitz 2 takes us to where Blitz 2 is. There you go. Similarly, that hasn't refreshed. We've got one for P-Paint as well, for personal paint. So again, open file, we just go volumes. Oh look, P-Paint, and straight into P-Paint, there it is, and we've got access to everything in there. Assigns are incredibly useful. It's almost like mapping a drive in Windows, but I find it much easier because you can kind of do it on the fly if you want. If you start up a program and it complains about not being able to access I don't know, drive colon, then you can assign drive colon to somewhere and get that program running. It's incredibly useful. So yeah, when you find that you're installing stuff on your work partition or maybe games partition, you may find that your user startup gets used with a lot for assigns and setting up various other bits and pieces in order to run. This user startup is a lot less populated on, well, I'll show you. It's my desktop 1200 rather than the beast in the corner there. So you know, we're not setting stuff up like retargetable graphics and the mediator bus board and CD writing software and stuff. This is basically the machine I use for bits basic development and for WHD load gaming. So, you know, user startup isn't as populated as the other machine. Now, third and finally, we have Workbench Startup. Bear in mind that I use new icons. I've got new icons installed, as you saw earlier in the user startup. So your Workbench might not look like this when you go into it. This is simply the icon pack that I've got installed for it. And frankly, I'd like to change it. I've got new icons installed just so that I get nice icons for my WHD load games, but I'd rather these were a bit simpler. Anyway, Workbench Startup, WBStartup as it's known. This is a directory that exists on your Workbench partition, as you saw, and you can basically drag applications, programs, things that can get executed from the Workbench, and they will get executed when Workbench loads. So when load WB gets executed, things in WBStartup also get started. So, for instance, in here, I'm using things like click to front, which is the thing where I can basically do this. This is a commodity, so if I run it again, that disables it. You see, I'm double clicking, that's not working anymore. So, click to front, that's why I've got that in there. It's a bit easier than trying to find these all the time sometimes, if they're hidden. Raw info is a replacement icon information thing, but to be honest with you, I don't think it's running properly on this, and I need to sort it out. Copy mem all in one. Copy mem AIO. These two are from Aminet. This is actually part of the Workbench installation, and originally came from the commodities directory in tools. Yeah, you've got loads of commodities in there, so you can put things like screen blanker, mouse blanker, cross DOS if you want to write 720k MS-DOS disks. You can change keys and no caps lock, various bits and pieces, but basically with Exchange you can see what is running in here and whether or not you want it to run. But I digress. We are looking at WBStartup, so that's a commodity from there. I've just dragged it and dropped it into WBStartup and it does what I want. These two are ones that I installed from Aminet, which is the best place on the internet for getting all sorts of applications, programs, games, demos, mods, sounds, text files, utilities, anything you can imagine. Check out Aminet. I'll put a link up, but any Amiga user should know Aminet because it is one of the best things about the system. And any developers who are watching this, please put your wonderful creations onto Aminet. There's nothing worse than finding out a new program or game has been released, going to Aminet and not finding it there. Everything should be on Aminet. I know it's easy to keep things on GitHub and what have you, but just every once in a while, please put a release on Aminet. Anyway, WBStartup. CopyMem AIO is just a little program which is supposed to speed up some memory routines. Whether it does or not, I haven't done any benchmarks, but I've popped them in there. The eagle-eyed amongst you may see this unused directory over here. I've created this myself because I've basically, sometimes I'll put stuff in WBStartup. I won't like what it does. I may go back to it at a later date, and rather than delete it and have to find the archive again, or swap over SD cards and copy it all over, I'll just drag the icon off into unused. And anything unused won't get executed, so we're fine. And that's Workbench Startup. Right, I'll try and explain some of the stuff that is in my startup sequence. Here we go, S startup sequence. Okay. So, you may have seen at the top this patch OpenWB, and then also, no, I think that's it, patch OpenWB. I think that's for new icons, just to set up something within the startup sequence so that new icons runs properly. But I'll correct that with a little thing across here if need be. FBlit, ftext, these are, that's how that works. FBlit and ftext. FBlit is a way to put certain screen drawing routines into fast memory to really speed things up. ChipMem is used for displaying stuff, but of course it's a finite resource. You can never go above 2 meg on a classic Amiga. I know there are ways of doing it in emulation, but I don't use emulation, so let's use fast mem. I've got a 16 meg of fast RAM on this machine. Most of the time it's not getting used, so let's bung some routines into fast mem and try and speed up Workbench redraw, general GUI redraws. ftext similarly does basically the same thing as FBlit, but does it with text. So it bungs drawing into fast RAM to speed up the operation. What else do I have in here? FP prefs, full palette prefs. Full palette. One thing you may notice when you install things like new icons, and you start getting some really complicated new icons, is that basically things don't really start to display very nicely. So FP full palette is something from Aminet again. Aminet, good old Aminet. Which does its best to basically create a good palette for icons. So this is a 16 colour screen, and as you can see, that's much nicer than it would be if it was just using the standard Workbench palette scheme. It's kind of a better, more intelligent, more accurate way of pens getting assigned, rather than the Amiga operating system deciding this is what you're having and no dice. These funky pink and blue ones, icons, this is something that you can actually fix in FB prefs, because, let's see if I can find it. It's full palette. So here, you can actually alter the palette yourself. So as you can see, this one here, this pink, we've got something very similar over here. We don't really want these two pinks, so we could actually make this more of a dark grey, maybe, like it's supposed to be. They're using what's known as the Magic Workbench palette. So Magic Workbench was designed to provide a nicer colour scheme for Workbench 3.0 and up, but you need to run this kind of tools daemon thing that fixes the palette for for those so that they look nicer. But there we go. I don't have Magic Workbench installed. So there you go, full palette, lovely. And I closed Black's editor. But anyway, I think that was all that I run from this machine. So yeah, any questions, please shout. So thanks for watching. I hope you found that informative. If you've got any questions about that or any comments as to the accuracy of what I just told you, then please do let me know, because I'd rather find out and then pass that on to you guys, so that, you know, I'm not feeding false information. And as you know, I have in the past recut videos in order to fix those errors. So again, thanks for watching. If you've got any ideas, please shout. I guess like and subscribe and all that if you want to, completely up to you, I don't mind. And cheers.